Can you help me with the numbers here? I'm looking at page 9 of your handout just to understand what's going on here. Help me understand. I'm looking down at a line that says change in debt. It's like the 5th line down there. So this would be change in debt, assuming that these programs are not extended. This is as written, as I understand it. Okay, so change in debt as written. So in the first year, it would add $227 billion to the debt in the first year. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Then by year 2026, the cumulative amount of debt that would have been added would be $1 trillion.
That's right.
So basically, as written, this bill adds $1 trillion to the debt in 5 years.
Yeah, and this is
Now,
the point.
they assume thereafter why taxes and so forth, because the programs have hit a cliff, they reduce that, gets back down to $274 billion. But the reality is it adds $1 trillion to the debt, even as written. And then the line below, of course, is yours with the extension, which is a very substantial number, $2.7 trillion by 2031. Help me understand also the first year. What are the sort of the numbers in the first year? How much is spent in the first year, and how big are the offsets in the first year? The net of that is 227, as I understand it. So
Right.
there's $227 billion more being spent than revenues coming in. So clearly, this is inflationary, at least in year one, where we're borrowing $227 billion.
That's right. So if we have budgetary offsets and taxes of about $50 billion in 2022, and so if we're adding 227 in debt, that you would.
It'd be 277 we're spending.
That's right.
So in year one, we're going to spend, under this bill, we would spend $277 billion and only take in $50 billion in taxes. So it's very substantially inflationary in the first year, and I presume that's going to be the case. I don't need to get the numbers each year, but for the first 3 or 4 years, that's going to be the case. So when I read from the administration that, oh, this is anti-inflationary, they're saying over the long term. What they're apparently pointing to is that in years 2030 or 2031, when these programs, as written, have all hit a cliff and have disappeared, you just have the tax increases at that point. So it would be anti-inflationary then, but of course the programs will continue. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, there's multiple moving parts here. So we would not, again, we tend to avoid words like substantial and so forth.
Right.
But nonetheless, we could imagine that inflation is probably could increase depending on what is actually happening with COVID and supply chains and so forth. So there's a lot of assumptions there that one has to make. If vaccine adoption was much higher, and supply chains started to come back, we would actually have less inflationary pressure. You could imagine a 1/4 point increase in inflation during the first year. Do we think it's substantially more than that? That's probably we don't think it's more than that during the first year. But clearly, it all comes to supply and demand, and where is supply going to be? Where is COVID going to be? Where is vaccination rates going to be? And so forth. What the administration is talking about, there's really 2 different elements to it. One is the infrastructure bill, which is separate. They're saying that that's going to complement private production, and that should actually increase supply and therefore be anti-inflationary. That is certainly possible over a longer period of time, but that also ignores the Federal Reserve. What is the Federal Reserve going to do to neutralize some of that inflation anyway? Because we think over long periods of time, the Fed does have a policy. It's not going to really allow, significant inflation. But over the short run, there's no question, increase in demand for cement and so forth could actually have some inflationary pressure. But it's so spread out. The time to build on infrastructure is so spread out. We actually think it's de minimis from that component. For this particular bill, it's a little bit different. Now we're talking about like the child tax credit and things like that. And that does leave money in people's pockets. And the question is, what do they do with that money? And it's actually, what the evidence shows is that over 3/4 of that money actually got saved. It's not actually just people going out and buying stuff immediately. And so we don't think it's going to be, inflationary pressure that's so large, but you could imagine potentially a 1/4 point.
Help me understand one more thing, and I'll let my colleagues take over. And that is, as I'm looking at your figures here, either using baseline or a continuation of programs, you show this as having a negative impact on GDP growth. Is that right? I mean, I'm looking at the charts here. In each case, it's a, I know you don't like the words substantial, but there's an impact on, a negative impact on GDP. I don't, Maya, is that, does your
Yeah, we
your
would call
modeling
that neutral, though. That's a pretty small effect for us.
Yeah, although when I see a negative in front of a number, it's a negative impact, maybe not substantial. But I was with one senator on the other side of the aisle who said to me, if we pass BBB, our economy is just going to take off. It's going to grow because we're going to be providing child care for people. That means more women are going to enter the workforce. More women in the workforce will mean more GDP. This is going to really ignite the American economy.
And we incorporate a lot of those effects, including increasing labor supply.
But net, you conclude this does not grow the economy. Do you both models, either on the as written or on a continuation basis, both models suggest that the economy will not be.
So we don't specifically model the GDP effects, but there are pressures in both directions, right? So there are different policies that will be pro-growth. The fact that it is debt financed in a lot of ways, particularly if you make these extensions, that is anti-growth. And so we find that the estimates that say it could be slightly negative make sense given those competing pressures. Same thing on inflation. The administration's making the point that this would not be inflationary because there's some policies that would get people back to work, things like that. But there are many policies that would be inflationary. We overall find that this is likely to be on net inflationary, particularly in the front years because it is so front-loaded. And so if you want to avoid the really big risks of inflation right now, one of the best things you do is you figure out how you pay for this and you don't front load it with all this borrowing in the early years at the time that we're trying to avoid an inflationary cycle.
If I can add something on the productivity aspects of it, which I think, oh, sorry, I'll talk into the mic. So the question about the economy taking off, so we have done a brief, it's on our website, about our estimates of the macroeconomic impacts of the child care and pre-K provisions, and a variety of programs. That was a wider brief. And from our reading of the literature that's out there, the effects in terms of broad GDP are fairly small from these programs. And the reason is that you're really helping the lower productivity workers. You can think of it basically in the following way. If a mother was capable of making a fairly high wage in the workforce and she has to take care of her kids, she can trade off working in the market, earning that money and paying a caregiver. A child that has caregivers who can't make that money would then force those caregivers to be available for that child. So these programs, from our reading of the literature, boost GDP slightly, but really not at the level of that you're going to have this huge takeoff of the economy. The big benefit of these programs is, again, that you are helping those people, and we do an analysis not just in terms of GDP, but also distributive effects. Again, it's all on our website. If you want to take a look, the effects for the lower income people are significant, but in terms of if we're talking about broad GDP impacts, these programs, in our estimation, are just not going to do it.